Welcome to the Wow MD podcast, where in each episode you will get in 30 minutes or less valuable pearls about holistic wellness, anti-aging, hormone therapies, beauty trends, and other facts you should know about our medical healthcare system and your health that no one is telling you. My name is Dr. Mirala Chernayanu. I am a conventional board-certified OBGYN physician who, after the loss of my father due to a careless and uncaring medical team, decided to retrain and seek certification in anti-aging and restorative therapies. What I know, I am happy to share with you. Welcome back. In this week's episode, I am going to pick up from last week when I laid the groundwork and I started the conversation and the topic about the WHI study. And I really want to lay out the weaknesses of this WHI study, just like I promised and like I started in the last episode. Just as a reminder, this study involved Premarin and Prempro. This was oral estrogen in the form of a pill synthetically made from a pregnant horse urine. It was given to women who were on an average 10 years past their menopause. Go back to the beginning of the last episode if you're just picking up this episode. When I talked about the changes, some of them irreversible, changes that happen to a woman's body when she enters menopause. Changes which are difficult and sometimes almost impossible to reverse, or very difficult to reverse. And consider the fact that the majority of the women enrolled in this study, which I told you in the last week's episode was mainly cardiac in nature, these women had already suffered significant cardiovascular changes due to the loss of estrogen. The majority of these women had not been treated with estrogen up until their enrollment into the study, and the average age of these women was 63 years old. So they were 10 plus years away from menopause. Now here's the thing. You can recover bone. You can rebuild new bone. You can recover muscle, rebuild new muscle. You can regenerate vaginal wellness and bring it back to normal, even after years of loss of function. But once your arteries are stiff and once your arteries have plaque, that is very difficult to reverse. It's probably impossible. And if you ask any cardiologist, they'll tell you it's impossible to reverse it. You just have to take statin to prevent more plaque. So let's talk about the age of the women. Many hormone specialists and brilliant minds in the hormone community argue that the study population was wrongfully chosen. Let's call this weakness or fallacy number one. Until 1992, when the study was initiated, oral estrogen was the leading form of hormone therapy for menopause in the United States and in the world. That's all we had back then. Consider the fact that by 1992, Premarin was the number one prescribed drug in the United States. Remember I told you in 1980s, estrogen was number 5 most prescribed drug? By 1992, Premarin was the number one prescribed drug in the United States. The sales of Premarin exceeded $1 billion in 1997, just 1 year. So the study that gave estrogen a bad name and a bad reputation was a very unique and interesting study because at that point in hormone management, there was enough research pointing to the fact that, hey, look, transdermal estrogen, it's a much safer long-term solution, because it doesn't do clotting and it doesn't increase risk of problems related to clotting, which cardiologists know that that's a big issue. But remember, women enrolled in the study were chosen by the cardiologists. The researchers who ran this study were not hormone specialists. So mainstream medicine at that point in the 90s had not embraced transdermal estrogen yet. Not on the scale it had embraced oral estrogen for 5 decades before. Oral estrogen was mainstream, so it was a no-brainer. That was the therapy that was chosen for that specific study, for the WHI study. And again, many hormone specialists and brilliant hormone minds argue that the oral estrogen was wrongfully chosen. This was the wrong hormone. in the wrong route. The oral route of administration should have not been chosen because all oral hormones pass through the liver, causing an increase in clotting, which will lead to subsequent increased risk of cardiovascular events, which it was exactly what was found in the study. So let's call this weakness or fallacy number 2. Now, in order for this study to involve so many women, obviously a very large amount of medication was needed. Wyeth Earth's pharmaceutical company donated the Premarin and the Primpro. Remember, Premarin was the pregnant mare urine synthetic estrogen. I want to tell you a little bit about this hormone. This pill contained at least 10 estrogens. The dominant ones were estrone, 50 to 60% was estrone, and equine estrogen, that's about 20 to 30%. Less than 5% in the pill was bioidentical pure estradiol. Let's call it clean estradiol. Now, we look back now, considering all the options that we have available today in 2025, and we can say, wait a minute, why are we comparing this pill with what we have now? What about the 100% estradiol oral pill, the bioidentical oral estrogen? What about the 100% estrogen patch? What about the bioidentical 100% estrogen gel? What about bioidentical compounded clean Mexican yam estrogen? Are they all the same as this horse urine estrogen combination that was used in the study? No, they're not the same. They are far from being the same. Now, just a little history for you. I do have in the show notes this link to a brief history of hormone therapy. Please read it. It makes for a fascinating read. The first commercial preparation of estrogen began as an estrogen complex extracted from the urine of pregnant women. It was called Emanin. This was before 1930. Oral bioidentical hormone replacement therapy was first used for menopause symptom relief in the 1930s after Canadian researcher Dr. James Collip developed a method to extract an orally active estrogen from the urine of pregnant women. After this doctor sold his patent to the pharmaceutical manufacturer called Hearst, Emanin was subsequently replaced on the market with Premarin. Remember, pregnant mare urine. Because its manufacturer, Hearst, later Wyeth Pharmaceuticals, found it was so much easier to deal with pregnant horses than pregnant women. Obviously, it wasn't the same, but who cared, right? The pharmaceutical company, Hearst, McKinnon, and Harrison, developed Emanin as the first oral female sex hormone. It technically was the first bioidentical estrogen therapy, but it was very expensive to produce. The history of bioidentical hormone therapy is complicated, and this type of hormone therapy is highly debated. We're not going to touch on this necessarily today, other than just briefly, but I'll come back and talk more about that. I will point out one last weakness to this study. Since our natural sex hormones, estrogen included, work like a lock and key mechanism with our human hormone cell receptors, when we use non-bioidentical hormones instead of the identical biological versions of our hormones, is like trying to unlock a vault with a key that doesn't fit. It may partially work, sometimes not at all, and it may even cause harm to the lock, which is the receptor. I believe, and so do many others, that this is the reason why there are so many unintended consequences and adverse reactions with the synthetic hormones like Premarin and more specifically with Primpro. Failing to include natural bioidentical hormones, specifically progesterone alongside estrogen instead of progestin, into the study was a major weakness and fallacy. Now let's call this weakness number 3. And here's the thing. This study was started in 1991 and ended in about 2005. Micronized bioidentical progesterone was not FDA approved until 1998. Progesterone was expensive to make. They hadn't found a solution on how to make bioidentical progesterone in a way that was feasible, easy technically, somewhat cheaper to make, and healthy for the patient and guaranteed to work and to be absorbed. So we didn't have micronized bioidentical progesterone until 1998. So at the time the products were chosen and selected for this study, the scientists and the doctors involved chose what was available and was considered safe at that time. I'll get to why the estrogen chosen was not that bad, in spite of the fact that it was mainly estrone and equine estrogen. But the progestin choice was literally the key for all the negative outcomes, including cancer risk. Bear with me, I'll explain it all. So just to wrap it up, this study had 3 major weaknesses. It used the wrong hormone via the wrong route and gave it to the wrong women. How did this happen? Well, I told you, it was run by cardiologists. Nobody asked any brilliant hormone specialists or minds, hey guys, what is the best hormone to do? How should we choose our patients? How early, how young, how late, how many years? And how should we give the hormone? Again, it used the wrong hormone, the pregnant mare urine estrogen, and progestin, as opposed to their bioidentical versions, which is what we have today. These hormones were given via the wrong route, orally as opposed to transdermal, specifically for estrogen, because the oral route is subject to that first pass effect of the hormone metabolism through the liver, increasing risk of clotting. And last but not least, these hormones were administered to the chosen women, which were the wrong population. They were women in their 60s who had already suffered significant changes due to the loss of estrogen for more than a decade after they entered menopause, specifically cardiovascular changes. And here, like I said, what's important and very interesting, you can reverse osteoporosis. And interestingly enough, outcomes for osteoporosis were improved even after 1 decade of no estrogen when women received estrogen. But the cardiovascular changes were worsened by the intake of the synthetic progestin on top of the oral estrogen, because that worsened that clotting risk, which is a known risk and disclosed on every single birth control pill package insert. And all of this contributed to the cardiovascular negative outcomes. Now, I want to continue this conversation about how estrogen got its bad reputation. Believe me, this study was the biggest medical news of the year in 2002. And it was a very important landmark study that showed very clearly and irrefutably that oral equine estrogen combined with an oral progestin for hormone therapy after menopause will increase risk of clotting, will increase risk of heart attack, stroke, dementia, and breast cancer. And that is why I, and many doctors like me, do not use oral hormone therapy in my practice. And that is why we do not use horse hormones. And that's why we never prescribe a progestin for hormone therapy, only progesterone. Let's continue the discussion on how estrogen came to have such a bad reputation. Now, I want to start shifting the focus in this episode on the fear of breast cancer and why is it so difficult to reverse some of the damage that's already been inflicted on the estrogen's reputation by this WHI study. I ended last week's episode discussing, and I picked up this week, that the WHI involved the wrong combination of hormones given to the wrong women the wrong way, orally. Again, in 1991, when the study was initiated, oral estrogen was the dominant established form of hormone replacement therapy for 5 decades. However, in 1991, when the study was initiated, there were already 2 FDA-approved products on the market for transdermal estrogen. Estroderm was FDA-approved in 1986, and Vivel was FDA-approved in 1980. Obviously, there was more data, more research, and more availability and a lot cheaper pricing for oral estrogen compared to the patch. Just to give you an idea, even in today's world, oral estrogen is probably $5 for a month's supply or less, whereas the patch is $80, right? So you can ask any doctor who knows anything at all about hormone therapy. They should be able to tell you that oral estrogen and transdermal estrogen have very different mechanism of actions, bioavailability, and very different side effect profiles. So very different consequences and a very different impact on a woman's body, because transdermal estrogen will bypass the liver, which is a very important aspect of how and why transdermal estrogen is superior to oral estrogen. Now, again, I want you to consider the fact that this transdermal estrogen and oral estrogen have very different safety and risk profiles because of this unique feature, not going through the liver. Oral estrogen goes to the liver, it's processed by the liver, and there are some very serious consequences for our health, whereas transdermal estrogen does not go through the liver, and it's very much safer. Now, cardiovascular risk of clotting was greatly increased by Primpro. And what I want you to know is that the number of women in the WHI study who developed blood clots in the legs, that's DVT, was 200% higher in the women taking Primpro compared to the placebo group. The number of women who developed blood clots in their lungs, pulmonary embolus, was 213% higher in women taking Primpro compared to the placebo group. Now, the risk profile for stroke and heart attack was minimally increased, but still statistically significant. The number of women who developed heart attacks was about 29% higher for women taking Primpro compared to the placebo, and the number of women who developed strokes was 41% higher in women taking Primpro compared to the placebo. Obviously, the risk for clotting is much higher with oral estrogen, and it will do that to a woman. We know that. The entire medical community knows that. And here's what is interesting. The second arm of the study, remember I told you there were two arms of the study. One used Premarin only with no progestin. Those women had a hysterectomy. They didn't need progestin. The other arm used Primpro for women who had a uterus. The arm that involved oral estrogen only, Premarin, did not increase risk of adverse heart attacks and strokes at all. It did increase risk of clotting and DVT. Any oral estrogen will do that. It's written on your package insert for the birth control pill that you might have taken for 20 plus years. Now, because of this study, and this is taking a little detour here, and because of oral estrogen being the only estrogen studied in the WHI study, starting with 2003, remember the study ended in 2002? Starting with 2003, all estrogen products have been assigned by the FDA a black box warning for increased risk of clotting, heart attack, stroke, etc., regardless of the fact that subsequent research has shown that transdermal estrogen or vaginal estrogen does not have this increased clotting risk profile. The patch, the gel, the vaginal ring, none of these have the increased risk for menopause. Now, just this morning, I was reading a post by a prominent urologist who is fighting to remove the black box warning for vaginal estrogen, the black label that I told you about, which apparently warns women that this vaginal pill that you're going to use or vaginal cream twice a week, it puts you at risk for a heart attack or a stroke, or it's going to give you a clot. So in case you didn't know, even though I've spoken about this in a few of my previous podcast episodes that I launched for Valentine's Day this year in 2025, estrogen is vital for vaginal and urinary wellness as a woman ages. Why is it important? As a woman ages, there will be significant changes of the vaginal lining and the urinary tract because the loss of estrogen will involve dryness, thinning of the lining, both of the urethra and the bladder and the vagina, and significant changes in the microbiome, which is the friendly bacteria in the lower urinary tract and the vagina, which will lead to serious potential for increased risk of urinary tract infections, also known as UTIs. UTIs can be silent and deadly. There are women who do not have any signs and symptoms until they have sepsis or they're very sick. And it just starts with, I'm leaking a little bit more than normal, where I'm getting up at night to pee-pee and I don't know why. UTIs can kill older women, and they do. It is our job as physicians to understand the value of estrogen for a woman's body, preach loudly about it, and to tell not just our patient population, but our audience, if we have one, in the form of social media posts, podcasts, and any other outreach speaking engagements that we can do. We literally need to pick up the microphone and speak about the value of saving lives, which estrogen ultimately has. Estrogen saves lives because it prevents UTIs after menopause, and for many other reasons. But I'm just using this one right now. And here's the thing, vaginal estrogen comes in compounded or FDA-approved forms. It's very simple, easy to use. As long as it is used regularly, almost religiously, vaginal estrogen products can and will offer women protection from UTIs. But you can't use it for a month and wait for everything to come miraculously back to normal. No, you have to use it probably for 6 months before your UTIs are spaced out more and more and more. Maybe you have to combine it with the laser. Like I said, 1 ounce of prevention, it's worth more than a pound of cure, much more. So it's better to prevent. And sometimes women, even if they are on oral systemic therapy or on patches, on gels, they still need vaginal estrogen. Some women just need it added to their protocol. And even though there is no research or proof to substantiate that vaginal estrogen twice a week will increase the risk of clots, the heart attack, of stroke, which is consistent with the black box warning that was slapped on this product, the FDA refuses to remove this black box warning that was added in 2003 to all estrogen products, regardless of dosage, regardless of delivery method, which again was triggered by a study that spanned the decade from 1991 to over 2001 and involved exclusively the oral synthetic equine estrogen with Pimpro. A study that ended 2 decades ago. We have totally brand new products with different safety profile. And vaginal estrogen, it's a product that's administered twice a week alone or in combination with something else, like patch or gel or ring or pellet, depending on the woman's needs. But there's a large body of evidence that this vaginal estrogen has huge benefits locally without necessarily impacting systemic levels, without needing progesterone, even though I prefer it for many reasons, which I talked about before. But more so, vaginal estrogen is safe to use in breast cancer survivors because levels in the circulating estrogen levels have not been detected. They're not consistent with the vaginal estrogen. So it's considered safe for breast cancer. Obviously, common sense, logical, analytical doctors and researchers do not understand what are the processes behind some of the FDA decisions in this, especially when FDA approves drugs so easily, drugs which have questionable benefits and a long list of side effects. But on the other side, FDA right now is being very hesitant and refuses to remove a scary label, a label which induces fear and is the reason why many women who likely receive this life-saving therapy prescribed by their doctors do not even start using it. They open it, they read the label, and they're like, oh, no, I'm not using this. My doctor's crazy. But this is a therapy that could save women's lives. Again, FDA made this decision to designate the black box warning for all estrogen products indiscriminately when such a label should have been only restricted to the oral products. Now, this warning is based on evidence that it clearly does not apply to many products which are on the market right now, which have a very clear safety profile. Why is it not removed? I don't have the answer, and it's no wonder doctors are losing faith in the fairness of some of the FDA's decisions, and the FDA has lost a lot of credibility with the regular people, and the public opinion is so low of it. Over a decade ago, being FDA approved really meant something. The more drugs the FDA approves that potentially harm women, like the UMABs that give women osteosarcoma instead of estrogen, right? The more confidence is lost in the FDA's ability to allow and regulate safe products for women to reach the market. The fact that there has to be a big fight and petitions submitted to the FDA to change the designation for a life-saving hormone product does not help with building credibility and restoring confidence that this government organization cares about saving women's lives or about improving the quality of life for women after menopause as they age and they get closer and closer to the end of their lives. Sorry, I digressed. Let me come back to the WHI study and why you as a woman need to question everyone who tells you estrogen is bad for you and ask them this very simple question. How do you know that estrogen is bad for me? Where do you get your facts and your data? Because if that person mentions the WHI study, you can explain and provide facts that will refute whatever evidence they present to you. And here's the top point I want to make, and the number one argument against the findings of the study that black labeled estrogen for women after menopause is the estrogen products studied in the Women's Health Initiative study are no longer the top estrogen products used today by the majority of doctors who offer hormone therapy for postmenopausal women. Less than 40%, I can't believe there's still 40% doctors out there who prescribe these drugs, but less than 40% of women who are using hormone therapy today, specifically related to estrogen, are doing so using an oral estrogen pill. Thank God. But still, it's a big number. Likely, the majority of women who are being prescribed oral estrogen are women who are seeing doctors who are not up to date with what is the safest hormone therapy modality available for women after menopause. Most likely, these could be internal medicine doctors, primary care doctors, maybe even senior OBGYN physicians who are simply outdated. Maybe they're a younger generation who are just listening to Big Pharma coming to them with these drugs. They're not keeping up. They're not aware of the most recent research, the most recent recommendations. They keep prescribing what they know, what they're comfortable with. And last but not least, they probably prescribe what the most recent drug rep from a certain pharmaceutical company that's selling oral estrogen for women after menopause comes and talks to them about. Everybody's busy. We don't have time to go to a lot of conferences. And these conferences, when they talk about hormone menopause, they give it about an hour. And the rest of the 15 to 20 hours are all kinds of other things. What are you going to learn in 1 hour? They prescribe what they know. They prescribe what they're comfortable with. They prescribe what is easy. Many doctors like to stay in their comfort zone. Now, here's the thing. The doctors like me who offer anti-aging, restorative, regenerative, holistic solutions for aging women, including hormone therapy, do not offer oral estrogen. If someone comes to me taking oral estrogen, I try to persuade them and explain to them in detail why they should not be taking it and why they should switch to transdermal estrogen. These type of doctors are the most up-to-date. They will only offer transdermal estrogen. Why is transdermal estrogen so different than oral estrogen? Well, I'm going to make it very simple. And I want to put this in simple terms, use an analogy that maybe will stretch your imagination a bit, but what if our estrogen is a person called Jane? And what if Jane has great intentions, but it turns out she's not that good of a person? Her actions unintentionally lead to poor outcomes. She is judged in a court of law, found to be guilty, and placed in prison. This is similar to what happened to estrogen after the WHI study. The researchers and the maker of Premarin and Primpro had great intentions, and everyone thought that oral estrogen taken out of the horse urine and chemically synthesized into a pill, combined with progestin to protect their uterus, will be saving women's lives and improve outcome after menopause. This was Jane. Chemically synthesized horse estrogen and progestin combination as an oral pill was found guilty of causing increased risk of clotting, increased risk of stroke, heart attack for older women, plus all kinds of other unexpected outcomes like increased risk of dementia and increased risk of breast cancer. Once the data was analyzed, oral estrogen was judged and found guilty of all these charges and literally banned, to the point where women whose lives were significantly improved and whose hot flashes were controlled and had a very nice quality of life at that point had to give up their treatment because their doctors refused to prescribe it. It took many years. It took more studies, more research, and more information about how some of the data was presented in a manner that inflamed mass media, inflamed doctors' opinions and public opinion, did so whether knowingly or unknowingly, clearly exaggerating some of the realities, but not highlighting the important stuff. The important stuff was that there was a lot of value, and it wasn't as bad or as grim as was initially presented. As it turns out, Jane, our horse estrogen with progestin, was not as guilty as she was initially found, and Jane was let out of prison on probation. Again, I'm talking about estrogen. Obviously, estrogen is making a comeback. Now let's consider Jane's cousin, Emma. Emma is the name given to the synthetic version of transdermal estrogen. Emma has done some of the same things Jane did, but Emma has not been found to be guilty of anything, even if the things she has been doing, hot flash resolution, improvement in energy and sleep and vaginal wellness, all of that, have received some of the same scrutiny Jane had. What if we simply decided to put Emma in prison because she's similar to Jane, though it has not been proven that Emma is guilty of anything? We do have a justice system that would protect a person called Emma, if not proven guilty, from being placed in prison like Jane was. But when it comes to estrogen, we do not have a justice system. So the public opinion and the great majority of women are rejecting all estrogen therapy on the basis of the judgment against horse estrogen extracted from a pregnant mare urine combined with progestin, all of it chemically synthesized in a pill, which is totally and completely different than the current modern approach to estrogen therapy, involving today's synthetic estrogen from a patch, bioidentical estrogen as a gel, bioidentical compounds derived from yams as bioidentical creams or pellets. All of these types of estrogen therapies are very different in terms of positive and negative outcomes when compared to the oral horse urine estrogen and progestin pill. The verdict against Premarin and Primpro is not a guilty verdict against all estrogen. That's what I want you to take from today's episode. On the contrary, but for some reason, all estrogen has been lumped in together and given a bad reputation. And I'm going to ask you this. If all estrogen has a bad reputation, why are we not banning birth control pills? They're just as bad as the Premarin and Primpro. The birth control pill, it's just a different version of Primpro. Next week, I will dig into the specific risks of why WHI scared all women off using estrogen with this supposedly great increased risk of cancer, and why estrogen was not the culprit, but instead, the culprit was the added progestin. That was the problem. I'll reveal all that and more in next week's episode. Thank you for trusting me with your time, and thank you for listening to today's episode. If the content I provided wowed you, was helpful and valuable to either you or someone close to you, please do me a favor and leave me a review. I am very open and welcome any kind of feedback as well as suggestions on any content ideas, so please forward those suggestions to Jessica, my patient care coordinator, through our website, herabeautyandwellness.com. And I look forward to our time together next episode.